started sharing.
All right, brilliant. Thank you. Welcome everybody joining us on YouTube. We're almost ready to get started. We're just letting people trickle in. Uh, and this session is being recorded, of course. If you prefer not to be on camera, just turn off the camera and change your name. Uh, and that way it won't show that you're here for any reason. We don't ask what reason that is. So I am so excited that we're here today to talk about the founder of the book club's latest book. This is a rare treat because Anna always does so much for us, and she makes sure that the community is active not only here through the book club but also on social media through many different campaigns, many different programs. She is a fierce advocate of the work of history in the Black Atlantic and the period of the slave trade and its memory and legacies. And I think many of us here in the room, I'm looking at names, have benefited in one way or another from the spaces that Anna has created for us and continues to nurture. I myself was lucky that she thought of me when she was thinking of opening a book club. And this was, I think, conversation about the book club started right at the beginning of the pandemic when it was clear that we weren't going to see each other that often. We weren't going to have conferences. And that space, I have to say, was life-saving for me intellectually. During those 2 years, I was doing many other things, but the book club was a direct connection to colleagues all over the place. I was working on projects, but those projects were in small teams, isolated, working on some of my writings and research, but it was mostly isolated work, except for this book club opening up lines outside of our small little bubbles during the pandemic. And since then, I have remained until today uh, grateful and will continue to do so probably for the rest of my life to Anna for opening up that space. And I imagine that many of you feel this way too. So I think most of us here already know Anna, but if you don't, I could point you to her faculty page at Howard, but I prefer to point you to her Wikipedia article because she has such a bad ass picture in that Wikipedia article. I don't know who picked that picture, but it is so good. But Anna is probably one of the leading figures today in the study of slavery and its memory. And she has written important books on memory work around slavery, but also an important book on reparations and the conversation, doing a great job of mapping out for us what those conversations kind of have looked like. And now with this book, a monumental piece is giving a book that we can all use in our classrooms to introduce the field of the study of slavery and its memory at large, from even before the 1492 all the way to the present. And this is the book that we're here to talk about. I don't know how many of you had the pleasure already of reading it, but if you haven't, that's why we're going to pass the mic very soon to Anna for her to tell us about the book in her own voice, in her own words, to tell us what you're going to find in this book. And then once Anna tells us in her own words about the book, then we're gonna have a conversation together. So the way that this usually goes is I'm ready to pass on the mic to the community right away to ask questions. But if I notice an awkward silence because you're intimidated by Anna, I will ask the first question or two myself. So that having said, join me with emoji applauses in welcoming Anna to her own book club uh, to talk to us about her monumental new book, Humans in Shackles. Take it away, Anna.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. Then it's a real pleasure. Then Alex has been doing this with me, and before in the past during the pandemic with Jessica Johnson and Vanessa Holden. And this year, after a pause, I don't know, for perhaps 2 years, we stopped doing this at the end of 2021. This year, we decided to restart this work. I think that I hear a noise. If you can just, okay. But in any case, we restarted doing this because this is a moment which we proved we were right, because it's a moment that we need more than ever to talk about the history of slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, and their legacies. So this book was published by University of Chicago Press in October 2024. Then is a book, then Alex showed to you, then is a book of, then the edition that is out is a hardcover copy that has about 650 pages. And this is a book then that is a general history of slavery in the Americas, intended indeed for general readers. So it's a book that was published with an academic and university press, but it's a book intended for general readers. And the goal of this book is why I wrote this book is because usually I write these books because there are things that bother me, and there are topics that I want to learn more, that I want to do more research. And this particular book, one of the elements that bothered me was the fact that all the general histories of slavery that we have, they basically they are centered on the British Atlantic world, or usually on the United States, and then excluding especially then Brazil and the African continent. And I have been doing this work on memory of slavery for more than 20 years now, and especially connecting West Africa and Brazil. And I've been concerned about how slavery is memorialized in the public space. And this has been, of course, not necessarily something that was trending then until recent years. Over the past years, then especially after 2020, all this discussion about the monuments and the removal of the monuments and the fall of the monuments, especially the Confederate monuments, brought to light how it is important for historians to engage with what is not only the history of the slavery, but engage also with how slavery is memorialized in today, how slavery, what is the significance of slavery in the present. But with this book, I was not trying to retrace the history of how slavery is memorialized, which is what I tried to do in my previous work, but to provide us this panoramic history of slavery in the Americas, by centering not on the Atlantic world, the British Atlantic world, but centering on also on the South Atlantic world, that is this part of the hemisphere that connects Brazil and then West Africa and West Central Africa. So the book provides this long history. And of course, I address Brazil, but I also put Brazil indeed side by side with the United States, with the Caribbean, other parts of Latin America. Then I wanted to give Brazil its full space in a narrative that tells the history of slavery in the Americas that up to this day didn't exist. Now, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with this story, and many are not, because I've been teaching this history in the classroom in a historically Black university at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And many students, they do not know that Brazil is the country in the Americas that imported the largest number of enslaved Africans during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, meaning nearly half of the 12.5 million enslaved Africans were put on slave ships then in West Africa, West Central Africa, and Southeastern Africa to be sent to the Americas. Nearly half of that number ended up landing in Brazil and transported then by Portuguese and Brazilian slave merchants. So Brazil, despite this big importance in terms of the demography of the Atlantic slave trade, has been ignored in this long and broad histories of slavery that we have. Then for you to have an idea about which book I'm talking about books by David Bryan Davis, the late David Bryan Davis, Ira Berlin, then also the Hugh Honor. We have also then Robin Blackburn. All these books were written by men, then let's say then men who are then based in British and North American universities, and they are not people who read then primary sources and the literature that is beyond the literature that is written in English language. So this is one of the reasons why these books are all centered then on the British Atlantic and the English-speaking Atlantic world. And in comparison to the United States, then these numbers that I was referring to regarding Brazil, then Brazil imported then more than 10 times the number of enslaved Africans that were brought to the United States. Then if you talk about estimates of how many enslaved Africans were brought directly from Africa to present-day United States, you are referring to 300,000 enslaved Africans. In Brazil, you are referring almost to 6 million. Then, of course, we have to take into account the mortality rate through the Middle Passage. In these numbers, you can look at the slave voyages database because they are always changing as well. In addition to that, there has been also this recent this recent emphasis on 1619. Then 1619, as you may know, is at the date when the first documented enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia, in present-day United States. However, of course, that this date has been a site of memory associated with the history of African Americans in the United States for many decades now. But this date has been referred to as a sort of point of origin, has been referred also as the beginning of slavery in the Americas, and this is not what it was. In 1619, when that year occurred, there were already more than 100 years of a presence of enslaved Africans, and some who were no longer enslaved in the Americas. And throughout that century, before 1619, there were already about 300,000 enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas at that point. 300,000 is the total number of enslaved Africans who were brought to the region of present-day United States throughout the history of the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas. So only in the years that preceded 1619, we had already 100, we had already the number of enslaved Africans who arrived in the United States. So the attempt that I wanted to make writing this book was to tell this story from this panoramic point of view by taking into account the importance of Brazil in this narrative. And not only Brazil. Another point that bothered me, because I think that at the end of the day, we always write things about what bother us. And one of these elements was the fact that Africa, then the place from where enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas, was usually excluded from these books telling the history of slavery in the Americas. Because all these general books, they are written by Americanists, which to some extent I am, but by people who do not study history of Africa and who didn't conduct research in the archives about the African continent. So the idea of the book was to have Africa then in the first chapters and usually in the beginning of the chapters, and to have Africa throughout the book. because one of the contributions that Brazil can give to this story is the fact that the slave trade to Brazil continued until the 1850s. Brazil is also the last country of the Americas to have abolished slavery in 1888. And Brazilians, Afro-Brazilians, enslaved Africans who were brought to Brazil, they were constantly in contact one way or another with the African continent, with the new Africans who were arriving in port cities in Brazil, and some of them returning or traveling back and forth as sailors, as people who were participating in the Atlantic slave trade, or who were then conducting trade with the other side of the Atlantic world. So the book moves then, and if I give you an idea in terms of the chapters of the book, because this is something that I cannot do usually in talks that I give elsewhere, then of course the book has an introduction. The book starts then with the encounters. Chapter 1 is titled Violent Encounters, then is about these first contacts between Africans and Europeans during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. The second chapter is Catching People, that is about the processes of enslavement in West Africa and West Central Africa. Then we have a third chapter that is Trading in Humans, that is about how these captives that were captured, who were free people who became captives, how they were sold into slavery on the coast. After this, chapter 4, Atlantic Crossings, that is about the Middle Passage. Then we have chapter 5, which is a chapter about the sites where enslaved people who recently arrived in the Americas, that where they died and how they were buried. Then it's a chapter about death. After we have chapter 6, that is about the slave markets, then different kinds of the slave markets in the Americas. Then you have chapter 7 on the plantation. Chapter 8 about urban slavery, that is titled Toiling in the City. Chapter 9 that is titled then Women Who Fed the City, and is then focuses on the work that women, the enslaved women, either born in Africa or in the Americas, the work that they performed in the cities, usually selling food, but providing a variety of other services. After this, we have chapter 10, that is sex and violence. Chapter 11, that is on families, creating and recreating families. Then chapter 12, about motherhood, that is mothers in shackles. Chapter 13, resisting bondage. Then all kinds of resistance against slavery that were not necessarily only rebellions. We have then chapter 14, ways of congregating, that deals with festivals and religion, especially Catholicism, and how African religions were in dialogue with other religions, such as Catholicism in the Americas. Then we have one particular chapter on rebellions, and this is a chapter that I put in connection different rebellions that we had, especially then in the 18th and 19th century. Chapter 16, then we move towards emancipation, then with all kinds of fights for freedom, then and emancipation. And then chapter 17, that is the last chapter of the book before the conclusion, is Africa's homecomings. Then it's about the return of Africans who were brought to the Americas, then either starting with the American Revolutionary War and then moving through the case that we have in Brazil after 1835, when freed people and people around them returned to West Africa after a rebellion that we had in Bahia in 1835. And then I even move up to Marcus Garvey in order to give this sense that this idea of return to Africa was always part of then it's in Africa that it started, and is still in Africa where it ends. So another element, in addition to Brazil, in Africa, especially West Central Africa, from where most enslaved Africans, they were brought to the Americas. Another point that the book makes is to give a central role to enslaved women. Then this has been also an issue over the past years, that we had then a great number of new books focusing on the histories of enslaved women in the United States and in the Americas. But enslaved women, usually they have been segregated in these books and not considered in the general narratives about their history, about the history of slavery. So the book uh, deals with enslaved women since the beginning, since the first chapters, and until the end. So this is what the book is about in terms of the sources. Of course, I used a variety of sources that I used in generating the work that I do. Then I used ship logs. I used the slave narratives where they are available. I used then slave ads, then in newspapers in different languages, in French, Portuguese, in English. Also, I use the other kinds of sources that usually historians do not use in their works, but due to my training, is something that I think that is important to be incorporated in this kind of work, which are visual sources. Then I have, the book has about 45 then illustrations, that this includes engravings, watercolors, and also photographs. Then the book incorporates all these sources to some extent also to engage a kind of approach that I have been developing with my work on memory, that is this focus on the human dimension of the institution of slavery. Then this is not a book, demographic is important. It's important to make the argument about why Brazil is central in the history of slavery in the Americas. But at the same time, the point that I want to make here was not to provide an economic history of slavery or a history of slavery that is focusing on demographics, but a history of slavery that tells the stories of individuals and groups and people who recreated their lives in the Americas while keeping Africa as an important dimension of their experience. Then to some extent, this importance of memory is about this lived experience that to me was central, not only when I was doing the research for the book, but also when I was writing the book. So I am going to stop here, because of course that I already spoke more than I planned, and we can have questions, comments, or complaints, whatever you want to do with this period of question.
All right. Well, thank you. Now we are going to open ourselves for questions. You and also, there's two ways to go about questions for Anna. Thank you, Anna. So the first way to do this is what David just did, which is to raise his emoji hand. But David, before I pass the mic to you, to ask you a question, I also wanted to open up the opportunity for you to ask your question in the chat if you wanted to, and if you prefer not to come on camera for any reason, just want to put the question on chat and let us know that you just want me to read the question. Be happy to read your question for your chat. If not, we always prefer if you turn on your camera on and raise your hand and ask your question yourself. So David, I'm gonna put the spotlight on you and remove myself so you can ask your questions. Give me 1 second, and I'm gonna leave in a second. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Alex. That was a very good promotion of your book. I usually go to all the bookshops, and there's always stuff about not just the slave trade, but about the personal stories of those who are enslaved as well, which is really cool. I just found another book called, not promoting anything, but Survivors, and it's a wonderful book about the last Africans to be brought into slavery in North America. I bought it, I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited by it. I'm also excited by your book because it's about the other slave trade that is not really spoken about in the media. Well, I'm doing some research of my own because I'm about going to give a speech next week at my local church. But one of the most interesting things that I did some research on is how uh, Black women enslaved or self-emancipated have been the bedrock for shaping the political landscape in the post slavery slavery period, especially in the context of the United States of America, the post civil rights period. In your research about Brazilian slavery and post slavery in Brazil in especially after 1880, what have you found that did you find any differences in comparison with the North American experience? And if so, how did the experience of Black women in Brazil differ from African American women in the fact that Brazil banned slavery in 1880, while North America officially brought in a ban in 1865?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. This is a very broad question. And the period of post-emancipation in this book, then this is a long book about the history of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, then it's not a book about post-emancipation. Even if I have this chapter on the period of emancipation then that is one of then almost one of the last chapters of the book. Then I would say that if I try to be succinct, I would say that there are elements in this experience there are common elements in these experiences. One element, however, that differs is the fact that in Brazil, especially in the urban areas, enslaved women, they had much more access to purchase their own freedom than in the case of the United States. Even if in the United States it could occur as well, but access to manumission, to self-purchase, was much less present. So in both cases, enslaved women, they were taking a lot of initiatives either in the United States or in Brazil in order to emancipate themselves through means that included self-purchase, but by running away, by helping their families to escape, by buying the freedom of their children, for example. This during slavery. Now, during the period of after emancipation, it depends until when we go. Then there is no flat answer, because this is what we do in history. Then things change over time, and there is no flat answer to give about what Afro-Brazilian women and African American women were doing that were common or different. What I could say from the work that I did for another book that is not this one, which is the book that I wrote on the history of demands of reparations for slavery, is that freed women and their descendants, either in Brazil or in the United States, they have been central actors in the demands for reparations. Then if you are interested in this story, perhaps my book on reparations is more appropriate for that, because in that book I tell the story about and connect different women, either in the United States and also in Brazil, Cuba, and elsewhere, who led this fight for reparations for slavery. So probably this question is not what you are looking for, but then because it's not really part of what I do in the book, at least not the period that you are asking about. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to reading your book when it gets published in London.
Yes. It was published in Europe and the United States. Then it's available in London. Yes.
Okay. I'll look out for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Daniel, quer fazer suas perguntas? Do you want to ask your question, Daniel? I saw you wrote in the chat, or you want to put him in the chat. I don't see Daniel. He wants to ask it in this. He's in the chat, yeah. First question asked by Daniel Costa from Portugal. What did you find out about the trade itself? Was it mainly a private venture, or did it have state support?
Yes, thank you, Daniel, for this question. It depends on where you are referring to. Then, if you are talking about the British slave trade, this is much more about state support. We can say in the case of the Luso-Brazilian slave trade, there was some support, but there were many most then traders involved in this in the trade of people were doing that by themselves. And here also there is an important focus on the period of the illegal slave trade in the case of Brazil after 1831, which gave really much more space for these individuals who were private traders. In addition to that, also for the French slave trade is a similar case. Then it's a combination of both. A combination that depends on the period in which one will have more weight than the other. And in the case, of course, of Brazil and Portugal, we know that this intervention of the state, then we didn't have, we had companies in some periods of time, but it was not as prominent as we had, for example, in the case of France, or in the case of Britain, and even in the case of the Dutch. Okay, you have another question. And what about the sources? African traders captured the slaves and sold them to the foreigners, or Portuguese, English had their own expeditions to get the slaves. Sources are little known. The Atlantic trade is more publicly known. I am not sure if I understand your question. The sources are known. There are many sources, and for all the traders, the trades that you were talking about, either the Portuguese, the British, the French slave trade. So the sources are known.
I think, Anna, I think his question is one that you answer at the beginning of the book, which is the question about who's capturing the people and who's selling them into the trade. So in the beginning, of course, it's about who's doing the raids. Sometimes the European powers are doing the raids, the Portuguese starting in the 15th century, and then sometimes it's war or kidnapping, etc. That's what I think the question is about.
Yeah, yes, I see. But okay, he asks first about the sources, then he asks about who was capturing. Most part of the time, enslaved Africans were enslaved through warfare. Then most part of the time it was not Europeans conducting raids, but in the very beginning of the Atlantic slave trade in the late 15th century, in the first chapters of the book, it shows that the Portuguese were conducting raids in West Africa. After that, when we moved to West Central Africa, there the Portuguese were also participating in raids, and there they established colonies. So depending on where you are looking, the Europeans, and when I say here the Europeans, I am referring to the Portuguese, they were leading these raids, depending on where and when. However, most part of the time, if you are referring to West Africa, for example, then Europeans, they were usually restricted to the coast, and the great majority overall of enslaved Africans, they were captured during as part of the byproduct of warfare. So in the first chapters of the book, I really detangle all that in order to clarify what was going on, how a person who was born free could eventually become enslaved and to be sold overseas.
We have Colin. Colin, you want to turn on your mic and I'll put a spotlight on you? You ready?
Yeah, it's an honor to be in community with you, Doctor. Thank you so much for being with us today. So I haven't gotten to chapter 10 because I'm still like in the middle of your book and like other books. I can't read that fast. So when I saw chapter 10, I skimmed through it, and I couldn't help but think of your colleague's book, Thomas Foster, and Rethinking Rufus, and sexual exploitation of enslaved Black men in the Americas. So my first question is how do you see his text in those histories and the history of, I think it was page 278, like in your book, on the rape of enslaved men. How do you see his text and your text in conversation with each other is my first question. And my second question is where do you think this underexplored research should go next in terms of understanding the sexual exploitation of enslaved men?
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Colin. Of course, then Thomas Foster's book, which I organized a book talk for him when that book was published. I organized this at Howard University bookstore. That is an important book because it brings to light then that sexual violence was not only inflicted on enslaved women, but also on enslaved men. Then the book is in conversation indeed with his book and many other books, but in the case of the available sources for that particular, for this particular problem of sexual violence against enslaved men, I would say that the United States is not the best place to look at. And this is something that I said to Thomas Foster at the time when he presented his book, that one of the points that I brought was that that the sources, then the Inquisition records that we have either in the Spanish or especially in Portuguese, they are certainly the best place to look at violence against enslaved men. Then, because we do not have Inquisition, we don't have Inquisition in the United States, so we do not have these detailed records. Then in the book, I explored some of those, and looking also at the works of Brazilian historians who explored this history more in more detail. I think here especially about Ronaldo Vanfas. But then it is certainly in conversation. But there are all these these Inquisition records in the case of Portugal and Brazil that are richer, I would say, in much more detail to tell this story. So your question would be then, what is left to do about that? Yeah, like there is a lot. There is still a lot to be done. I think that is only recently that we have been then, and even historians of the United States, where the history of enslaved women and the sexual violence committed against enslaved men, that where this has been explored. So in the case of the United States, in the past, the argument was that the sources were not there, that they were not available. Today, we know that they are. So there is still a lot to be done. And I would say that in a book like this, when you are covering an entire hemisphere and more than 300 years of history, each chapter of the book, of course, could be in itself a book. But so there is a lot of work to be done. And I think that the book can be also a point of departure for anyone wanting to develop this kind of research, because you have primary sources, you have also a lot of secondary sources, and a long bibliography also at the end of the book that would perhaps point to possible new studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now we have a couple of questions. There's one coming from Adebayo Adewusi in Nigeria, and another from Kimberly Jones. There was another from Manu, but I actually, Manu's question should be interesting. Let's start with his. He asked his first a while back. He asked, have you dealt with historical fiction neo-slave narratives, in particular in respect of reaching out to a general readership? I answer him that we know of, you have not written fiction, but maybe you want to tell us about your secret projects.
Okay, I'm not seeing where is his question.
It's in the chat, Manu Herbstein.
Okay, I see. Have you dealt with historical fiction? Then it's a little bit. I have some mentions. For example, Gail Jones, Palmari's book that is mentioned. I also refer sometimes to to movies. But there, I had a lot of this. This is not the focus of the book. Then I am a historian. Then why? What I do in this book is not then the work of what perhaps literary historians would do, than to examine then novels and other kinds of narratives. Sometimes I evoke them, but it's not more than that. So the answer will be overall no, even if there are mentions. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
All right, so now we'll read Adebayo's question. It says, the author, you, spoke about using eclectic sources many historians do not use. I think that's quite impressive. I wonder if she also used sources from Africa outside what the slavers left behind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for this question. Well, I did my possible to use the sources that were available for me. For example, there are narratives by Africans. Then, for example, people who were enslaved in Africa, some of them that are well known to all of us, Equiano and others. Then there are some of these narratives that are in snapshots in different documents. And then these were also by Africans, people who were born and raised in Africa and transported to the Americas. I also used, and this is part of previous work that I did in the past, for example, correspondences that the kings of Dahomey then exchanged with the Portuguese. So these, they were trading in enslaved people, then they are slavers indeed. Then even if they are Africans, they are slavers, and at the same time they left written records that give then views about how they were approaching the problem of the Atlantic slave trade. In other cases, sometimes I refer to memories and collective memories where we have accounts. Then when I did research in the Republic of Benin, I then interviewed descendants of slave merchants and formerly enslaved people. Then sometimes I bring those, especially then there is one chapter in which I do that. So this, and also I use, then I make references sometimes to material culture and items then that are not sources produced by European actors. So overall, I made my possible to use wherever it was available for me that carries this African point of view.
Brilliant. And we have the next question from Kimberly Jones, who also asks us to read her question out loud. It says, "Hi, Anna. Lovely work. I wanted to ask you to speak more about African descended people's strategies to retain their memories of Africa in the face of Europeans' attempts to keep them subjugated." And I've had if I can take the liberty of adding a little bit another extra question there, because it's something that I've been thinking about because of something you said at the beginning, which is that when you were talking about how the book starts with Africa and ends with Africa, right? And that return to Africa, the motif doesn't really leave diasporic populations in the Americas. I wonder if you could tell us about what in the period that you cover are if there are moments and inflections of particular communities, particular regions, particular times in which that memory or that desire to return to Africa does leave. Because obviously for Garvey, it's a kind of recovery, right? It's a kind of recovery of something that wasn't there, that was kind of like akin to those movements to recover languages or things like that. So it's a more of a feature of modernity than something atavistic that survives from the 16th century or 17th century. So I was wondering if you actually traced in your work as you were doing this, it doesn't actually appear in the book, but I'm saying as you were doing this, if you saw moments of that. Anyway, but let's start with Kimberly first, and then.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Kimberly. Well, strategies. Then it's hard to say like then collective memory is about transmission. Then we have then stories that would be passed down. Then I'm not sure if this is about strategy, but it's about practices that people, families, groups, individuals would pass down their memories and stories to the next generations, either if they were kin or if they were just members of the community. Then this can be one of these strategies. Otherwise, the book refers to specific kinds of for example, foodways, or also religious ceremonies or festivals that carry elements of African cultures from specific places from where these Africans came from, and how those were incorporated in the practices that were possible to be developed in the Americas, especially then in terms of in terms of their religions, for example. Sometimes there are also references, of course, to naming, then names that are associated then with African ways of naming, depending on the language and the region. So these strategies, they are, I would say that they are naturally always present, and they will occur especially then through these ties that are associated with then the communities from their homeland, but also with communities that were recreated in the Americas through especially, I would say, in the case of Brazil, especially through the Catholic Church and the spaces that the Catholic Church allowed to exist, including then festivities, commemoration of saints, and religious ceremonies. So of course that this is not, then there are anthropologists and scholars who are particularly, whose works particularly focus on that, but my work then mention and draws on what these scholars they did. Any other cases I observed myself, for example, then particular churches, burial practices, which is an element, an important element as well, that material culture associated with funerary practices that are mentioned in that I mentioned in the book. So you can find those, like I would say, throughout the book, and of course the stories that were passed down, stories of enslavement in particular. Then in sometimes the same story being told in different ways. Alex, now I forgot your question.
I'll reframe and make it even simpler. Which is the book does a good job of actually, I think, and I think I agree with your how you label the introduction. It's a cultural history, right? But the word cultural there, the work is doing is actually is standing for what you just described. It's like basically these survivals that can. But at what point? And you trace in the end, in the last chapter, you talk about very well about how this survival actually then converts into a return to like literal return to Africa. You do a great job there. But I was wondering in your research, where did you see, and over the years of experience working on this, where did you see in the period before the 19th century the movement to forget the origin of those cultural practices? When did a sort of amnesia set in some places, and in what places and in what time, about the Africanness of those practices within the Black community itself? Or did you see it, or you never saw it, and you wouldn't even say that that's the thing? You would say that Africa, the place of origin of these practices within Black communities survives with everybody knowing that it's Black and that it's African. Uh, are you understanding my question? Like you said,
Yes. I do think that I understand. I just think that it's difficult to make generalizations for all the Americas when regarding these issues. Perhaps in the United States, Africa becomes more distant because of the space in terms of the end of the Atlantic slave trade and the arrival of new Africans. In the case of Brazil, I think that the argument that I make and the argument that others already made in the past is that there is a constant connection with the continent that continues throughout the period of the Atlantic slave trade and after the end of the Atlantic slave trade. Then the movement of return that starts in 1835 is part of that, but it continues through not only through memories, but through physical displacement of communities who want to know about this past and want to remember this past by going back to Africa and relearning, for example, either languages or religious practices. So it's a tricky question because it refers to the sort of origin that sometimes is imagined, sometimes is very real. But in these places such as Cuba, such as Brazil, and parts of the Caribbean, is much more alive than perhaps throughout the United States. But in some regions of the United States, we know that it remained also alive, and that that it's hard necessarily to know whether Africans themselves they had that memory, but by looking at records or then religious practices or things that enslaved Africans and their descendants they built, for example, in terms of material culture, we can see those connections. So I am not sure if I was able to answer your question, but I would
think
say
you
that.
did. It's an ambitious question, and I only thought about it talking to you today, which is, of course, you've done amazing work with memory in the 20th century, 21st century of these things. but then I thought about, well, but the memory has a history too. Like there was probably memory that can talk about in the 18th century, memory of Africa, that we can talk about in the 18th century, that we can talk about in the 17th century, and how is memory operating in these times. But I thought about it. To be continued, I'm sure. Right now, I want to give an opportunity for a last question. If anybody in the audience would like to ask Anna a last question. Yes, hold on. David, since you went already, I'm going to ask Lisette to join us here on camera. And David, of course, I'm sure that feel free to write to Anna or me at any point. And Lisette, I'm going to I'm going to put a spotlight on you and remove myself. Dale, pa'lante.
Gracias, Alex. I'll make my question quick. That way, David can ask his question as well. Anna, reading some of the content in the book, you mentioned bill of sales, for instance, as your sources, and I've also saw ads of fugitive and slave. In your research, have you found one piece of archival source that is your favorite? I know the book, it's 20 years of research, but have you found one piece, however big or small, because sometimes you go to the archives and you find a legajo that has 500 folios, but you could find one piece that might be the one piece that has had an impact on your research. Is there one source, one archival source that you have found that has impacted you and that has stayed with you, and where did you find it?
Thank you, dear Lisette. This is a difficult question because when we say find, is that are those that I read at some point. Then when I am always cautious to say that I found, because that looks like I was the first one to find something, and which is not necessarily the case, as we know. So I would say that there are several. Some of these, then I think that it's important to emphasize that the work that is in this book, there is archival research, and in terms of the literature, there are parts of the book that I did more recently, and there are parts of older research that I incorporated in the book. So of those, of course, I have my preferred ones and ones that shaped my work. For example, I would say that in the case of Dahomey, that is the place that I did more research about. There is this extensive correspondence of the kings of Dahomey with the Portuguese officials, and these the records that had, I would say, the most important impact on my work are the ones that are housed in the Instituto Histórico Geográfico Brasileiro, that is in Rio de Janeiro. This correspondence, the first person indeed who told me that these records were there was John Thornton. So that this was 20 years ago. John Thornton mentioned, because I was fascinated by Adalonzan, that was one of the kings of Dahomey. And then I went to that archive and read the correspondence. Since then, other historians did the work in that particular archive. And we had Pierre Verger then many years ago who worked on the correspondence, but in other places that we have, for example, Biblioteca Nacional in Rio de Janeiro, we have the archive in Bahia, and we have also parts of it then in the Portuguese archives. So I would say that of the older sources, that correspondence is what impacted me the most, because it's one of the sources where we can read African voices. and see the African perspective about the trade in enslaved people. But about the new ones, it's very simple. If you were asking about small things, I think that the ads for me are perhaps the most interesting ones. And seeing then how these ads, either slave fugitive ads, either in Brazil or in Saint Domingue or in the United States, how they carry so many similarities, and especially regarding the fact that on how enslaved women they escaped, bringing their children, or even children would escape by themselves. So in terms of the more accessible and newer sources for me, I would say that the similarities among these ads across languages and cultures would be the second example. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. All right. And with that, we arrive at the top of the hour and the end of this wonderful session where we got a chance to talk about Anna's book. And before I pass on the mic back to Anna and we reinstate her as a host and not as a guest, I wanted to, first of all, to those of you who have not read the book, to recommend it as probably the best overall survey of the whole history that we have right now in our hands in 2025 for use in the classroom. If you are doing a history of the Atlantic world, a history of America, world history, and you want to have, and you have a module on the trade and on slavery, this is the book that I recommend that you use. If this is the only chance your students are going to get to encounter this history, what is the book you're going to recommend? There it is. All right. Well, join me in thanking Anna, and I'm going to pass on the mic to her in a second after we celebrate her, so that she can announce our next book club, which is happening, I think, in a couple of weeks, actually. So thank you, Anna. Thank you, Anna, for your book, and thank you for all the work you've done for us.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much. And then my apologies, because I have to read here in order to not make any mistake. So join us then if you go to the web page that is Slaveryarchive.com. You are going to see that we have a section there that is called the Book Club. So you go there and you scroll down and you are going to see the list of books that we have for now and the rest of the year. And we have the next one on March the 8th, 2025. This is going to be a Saturday again. And this is the book, Cultural Legacies of Slavery in Modern Spain, that was published by State University of New York Press, 2025. And this is a book edited by Akiko Tsuchiya and also Aurélie Vialette. And this is an edited book, which means that it's a book containing then several chapters on this very important topic, that is cultural legacies of slavery in modern Spain. As you do know, there are very few books looking at either about the memory of slavery and in the Spanish Empire. And this is one of these groundbreaking books. You are going to have, however, in August 23rd as well, Transatlantic Bondage, that was edited by Lisette Acosta Corniel, who is here with us. So as you can see, we are bringing through the book club then dimensions of this story that have been not emphasized. Then we had Marlene Dowd with her book on Henry Christophe. We're going to have later on in September, Julia Garfield, also on Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So this one of March 8th is the one on modern Spain, and I invite you all to go there and to register and to join us that Saturday.
I want to
Otherwise,
say
thank you
that
so much.
I went to the book launch yesterday, for the legacies, cultural legacies of slavery in Spain, and it was fantastic. It was a packed house. And the book itself, I already had a chance to read it, but it even has some creative fiction in it. So this is, and it combines voices from within the academy and outside the academy. And it's a fantastic read. So I highly recommend. I hope to see you there the next one. Sorry, Anna, I interrupted you, but I just want to like share my excitement that I went to the launch and it was phenomenal.
Now, this is great. This is great. And I saw the pictures, and I'm looking forward to discussing that one. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming. It was a pleasure to see you all. And thank you, Alex, for the kind words. And see you next time. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.